Well, tonight we're going to have a debate that chastity will save the 21st century. To be chaste is to be restrained or in control of your sexual desires. Now, some people take chastity to mean abstinence, often before marriage, but tonight we're defining it in a way that it does not mean complete celibacy. But even so, that concept of chastity has become for many an antiquated, old world moral concept. And even despite its religious foundations, there are people of faith who also view it with suspicion. Sometimes chastity is associated with extreme conservatism, with unhealthy repression, with patriarchy, homophobia, and those tortuously uncomfortable-looking steel belts. Now, the world in which we live today, of course, is one in which there's an open encouragement of sexual expression. We're free to enjoy the pleasures of sexual intimacy in close relationships and even at first encounters. We flirt, we partner, we date, and we sext. Our fast-paced information age produces what for many people is a reasonably constant stream of sexualised content in advertisements, in music videos, even in our own selfies. It's unlikely, I think, that anyone tonight is actually going to be arguing that we go right back to the 20th century Vatican view of chastity, that sex be restrained only to married couples. But tonight we ask, have we actually gone too far? Is sex so pervasive that it's expected, and that whether or not conformity to culture has become the dominant driver rather than personal expression and intimacy? So some people say we need to slow down and take control and ownership of our sexual desires. Others argue that cultures valuing sexual restraint are not happier, but they're not safer, so why turn our backs on sexual freedom? And that's why we're here tonight debating the topic that chastity will save the 21st century. The first speaker for the affirmative, Scott Stevens.
Few topics expose the hypocrisy and the moral befuddlement of modern life, it seems to me, quite as clearly as sex. Sex, we're told, is a private matter. So what business do the moralists, the tub-thumping wowsers, and the desperate custodians of bygone social norms have in meddling in the affairs of consenting adults? But, of course, when said affairs do end up coming to light, as recently happened to the hapless customers of Ashley Madison, we drool and we leer and we poke fun at the dalliances of these poor promiscuous souls with a kind of prurient glee. We become Puritans, in other words, when it's other people's sexual misfortune. Sex, you see, is condemned in our time to being either illegitimately private, exclusively private, or excruciatingly public. It's either hived off from any serious moral conversation about the nature of human flourishing and then left to follow its own natural course, or else sex is played on gruesome and degrading public display. But we should admit, of course, that even in these permissive times, sex has never really been left to follow its own natural course, is it? Sex is always informed and shaped, and to some extent even chastened and constrained by something. The crucial question, seems to me, for us tonight is formed and shaped and constrained by what? For those sexual cynics who are perhaps a little bit too ready to concede that the young and the feckless are going to screw around no matter what, the best that these cynics can do is to try to minimize the harm done. We try to make sex safe, in other words. And so, in place of serious, concerted moral instruction about sex, its meaning, its responsibility, its exaltation, its glory, instead of doing everything that we can to ensure that the inheritors of sexuality, as they come of age, will be worthy of it, we cynically empty sex of its meaning and focus purely on its form. In other words, we turn sex into a matter of codes of conduct and physical hygiene. Now, one of the many problems with this reduction of sexual education to quite impotent ideas like respect and consent, two ideas that it seems to me are in no way up to the kind of tacit pressures, the quite insidious forms of violence that oftentimes accompany certain types of sexual relationships. The problem with reducing sexual education to ideas simply like respect and consent on the one hand and contraceptives on the other, in other words, protecting people from sexual violence and harassment on the one hand, protecting people from sexually transmitted diseases on the other. The problem is that such a formalistic approach is powerless, it seems to me, against the influence of the pimps of commerce and advertising, for whom sex is the bait of choice, as well as the pornographers and their wanton defilement of the imagination with their fantasies of violence and sexual degradation. Now, this tacit collusion, it seems to me, between the pimps and the pornographers, along with the purveyors of sexual hygiene, has produced one of the most disturbing aspects of modern life, namely a weird coincidence between two things that ought to be incompatible. On the one hand, there's a kind of compulsory promiscuity, the expectation that people will be sexually available, and if you're not, then why not? So on the one hand, there's a compulsory form of promiscuity, and on the other hand, there's what only can be described as a form of sexual hypochondria. In other words, we're expected to be available, but at the same time, we're terrified of being contaminated. We're expected to indulge promiscuously in free and easy relationships, but at the same time, we're terrified that something of that person is going to end up constraining me, that something's going to rub off, that somehow I'm going to be bound to something that I don't want. But both of these things, compulsory promiscuity on the one hand, sexual hypochondria on the other, both stem from the same rejection of the possibility that sex might be something more than just all about skin and hygiene. Is there a way for us to think about sex that escapes just the skin and hygiene polarity? Is there something about the way that we talk publicly about sex that can escape the public-private binary? Could it begin, as I think it does, with the acknowledgement that sex itself is a kind of extra-social act? That's how Henri Lefebvre, the great French philosopher, put it. That sex summarizes a society. Whatever society is in a whole, it then gets reflected in sex in minutiae. In other words, sex reflects society as a mirror. So just to the extent that we try to slip easily in and out of relationships without the cloying obligations of friendship, for instance, holding us down. In the same way that we pursue immunity from the things that once bound our forebears, for instance, in bonds of responsibility and mutual trust. In the same way that we try to escape from these things, so too do we try to escape from what sex might entail in terms of moral obligation. Ladies and gentlemen, what I'd like to propose to you is that chastity is precisely a virtue that is bound up with other virtues, that if we lose them, then there is something about our capacity to live peaceably and beautifully and well that we will be losing. Chastity is bound up with the virtues of compassion and forbearance, with the virtues of mercy and forgiveness, with the capacity to be empathetic precisely to the extent that chastity, when it's lost, ends up becoming a form of solitude. It ends up becoming a way of foreclosing sex in on itself, of focusing on sex itself rather than on the beloved. Chastity, however, is not legalism. Chastity is not legalism. It's not going without. Chastity, ladies and gentlemen, is art. It's the attentive dedication to the physicality of this person and no other. It's the attentive devotion to the specificity of this person. It's the attentive devotion and the thrilling rapture with familiarity rather than just novelty. Chastity, it seems to me, is the very thing that we need in order to break out of our little fortresses of fantasy-supported solitude and to enter into broader, deeper, wider relationships. If chastity is, in fact, the full regard that we give to the humanity of the other, if chastity is, in fact, the proper attention that we pay to another's dignity and needs, then will chastity save the 21st century? You're damn right it will.
This debate already reminds me of one of my favorite quotes. The journalist H.L. Mencken, who said, "Puritanism is the haunting fear that someone, somewhere, may be happy." You seem like a happy crowd. This is not a debate about self-restraint or the focus on the other or art. It's about social control. Self-restraint is easy. I know about self-restraint. I was a Jedi master of it in my early 20s. It was less of a voluntary exercise and more something imposed from without by every heterosexually inclined woman alive. And then one day I was driving my VW Beetle I know what you're thinking, how could he not get laid? I was driving, and before me, the words that I needed appeared as if they were written on the car in front of me. It was the 90s, and bumper stickers were really big. And it said, "Chastity is its own punishment." And I thought about that for about 20 years. But chastity is actually about far more than punishing oneself. Anytime somebody longs to bring back sexual restraint or chastity or monogamy, your ears should prick up, and you should listen for the notes that they don't play and for the words that they don't say, because the dominant theme is always controlling how much sex other people are having. That's right, the religions and the cults and the chastity mongers and the team opposite want you to have less sex. And when the moral crusaders want to reduce the sex that other people are having, they usually do something very clever and very efficient, and that is they make women responsible. Think of any custom regulating sex, and I can guarantee you that more is expected of women and girls than of men and boys. Those creepy purity cults in the USA, where girls get dressed up in a big white frock and go out with their tuxedo daddies, and they exchange rings and promises, and the high point of the evening is when that little girl gets told, "You're married to the Lord, and your father is your boyfriend." What a paradox for a 12-year-old virgin to navigate. Extramarital incest whilst maintaining strict chastity. Sexual suppression has a horrible and nasty and long history, as long as civilization itself, as long as humanity. Sexual double standards are nothing new. More than half of all traditional societies allow men some sexual variety and freedom. Only 10% of societies allow women something even remotely similar. And when extramarital sex is punished, women bear the worst punishment. In one tribe, one of the tribes that make up the Apache Nation in southeastern United States, if a wife was unfaithful, a husband could sort of choose his punishment, but the most popular punishment was to cut off her nose, because that would render her unattractive and make her less likely to stray again. What happened to an unfaithful husband when the roles were reversed? Well, he could be scolded by his wife. Scolded, I tell you. The scary lady's going to raise her voice. As civilizations arose around agriculture, people developed increasingly sophisticated laws, and while some of them had to do with the transfer of property and what to do if somebody kills somebody, mostly and predominantly those laws concerned sex, and in particular regulating female sexuality. The oldest legal document ever discovered from Mesopotamia was about female sexuality. Let's have a look quickly at the Romans, because we know the Romans were really into sex. They've got a reputation for that. Have any of you been to Pompeii, or even better to Naples, where all the shit that the Bourbons kind of dug up out of Pompeii is secreted away, and was until 2000. It took us until the year 2000 to catch up with the Romans. If you haven't been there, all I can say is so many clay penises. I think what they were actually excavating was the Roman equivalent to the sex shop. But not everybody enjoyed that endless sexual variety in Rome. If you were a wealthy man, then you could have sex with wives and girlfriends and boyfriends and prostitutes and slaves, male slaves, female slaves. Romans didn't care that much about same-sex relations. What they cared about was the active and the passive role. And it was undignified for a highborn man to be in the passive role. But if you were poor, or you were a slave, or you didn't have many options, then you could still have lots of sex, but really it was in the passive role. And if you were a highborn woman, laws and customs and religion absolutely ruled your sex life. Romans held feminine virtue and virginity in the highest regard, but mostly really for the daughters and the wives of wealthy and powerful men. And when things went to shit in the Roman Empire, and they did from time to time, the Romans loved to blame women. For over 1,000 years, the Vestal virgins tended the sacred flame in the Forum, and they, by doing so, kept Rome safe. And occasionally a big crisis would threaten Rome, and then the politicians would kind of look at their nails and suck their teeth and have a think about it, and then they would go, I know, a Vestal fucked somebody. Because it's obvious, right, isn't it? And then what would happen? She would be buried, still a virgin. Chastity is its own punishment. Now, the Victorians were also famous for their obsession with chastity. The influential Victorian medical writer, Dr. William Acton, mansplained it quite nicely when he said, the majority of women, fortunately for society, are not very much troubled with sexual feelings of any kind. So he really hadn't been speaking to a lot of women. The ideal for Victorian women was to be passionless. She did not initiate anything, not even a conversation. And frustrated? Well, were they ever? Victorian women were particularly troubled with an affliction called hysteria, the cure for which was paroxysm. Paroxysm is another word for orgasm administered by a doctor, which is how we got the vibrator. So I'm not going to argue that we got nothing good out of chastity, but it's almost nothing good. Just like the Romans, the Victorians were particularly obsessed with the chastity of high-born women, of the daughters and wives of wealthy men. The chastity imposed on well-to-do Victorian women as a consequence, because the men weren't expected to conform, resulted in ruining the lives of more women and girls, many times more women and girls than were these cloistered high-born women. Wherever moralists and prudes impose impossible chastity ideals on people, they hurt women, they hurt the poor, they hurt the otherwise disadvantaged. Rich, powerful men like to impose chastity to control their wives and daughters. Women often seek to impose chastity on other women in order to control what the competition is doing. The 21st century that I know is a complicated and busy place, but on the scale of humanity's history, it is a better place for more people than ever before. It doesn't need saving. Not by the folks who think that other people's sex lives are any of their business.
Well, I am, for one, very interested in the art of chastity. I'm also interested in the history of chastity. We've heard a lot about that. But what I'm more interested in is the future of chastity. I'm interested in how we can redefine the meaning of chastity so we can actually have a conversation about it. Because if we don't, then we can't have an open conversation about the subject at all. It is a word that shuts people down. It is a word that instantly evokes negative feelings and feelings that are linked to oppression or being told what to do. And that's because it is a word and a practice that has yet to be held in a new and modern light. One that is up to speed with the 21st century and not stuck in the 13th century, which we've just heard a lot about, which is around the time when the word first entered the English language. To most of us, chastity is, as we've all already said, has been purely associated with virginity or abstaining from sex because of religious reasons. It is not a conversation that we want to have because we want to have our freedom in all forms and in everything we do. And I know Nikki's going to talk to you a lot about that. And I actually agree with that, which is why I want to look at what could potentially happen if we redefine the meaning and broaden its terms. What if we were to look at chastity in relation to how we relate to society as a whole from our sexual being's perspective? Because after all, we are built to procreate. And because of that simple fact, we have a hunger and a desire which we cannot deny. And I am certainly not going to ask any of you to do that. Now, more than ever, we want more information and healthy sexual freedom of thought and behaviour. So, what if chastity in the 21st century became less about repressing what is only natural and more about a way to explore what it's like to not participate in the fast-paced mass consumption of each other that is currently occurring out there in the hookup culture, which in itself is a reflection of the debasing, disposable society that we have now become. We want. Instant gratification, validation, and the fulfillment of personal desires, even if they come at the expense of someone else. So I believe we can no longer afford to view chastity from the shackled history that Rob has spoken about, that gets dragged into the room whenever the word is spoken. We need to liberate ourselves from all of that and find the ability to release old thoughts and negative connotations that have surrounded chastity to date. My argument is that chastity in the 21st century should not be framed in a conversation about not having sex, but in a conversation about choosing to not participate in the current devouring culture that surrounds it. A conversation that says that when we choose to be sexually active, we are going to do it in our way. And that path will be authentic, it will be organic, and not shaped by anybody else. So what about authentic sexuality and how is that linked to the practice of chastity? Let's start with sex education in schools. Sex education is based on a risk factor approach, how to do it safely, how to prevent unwanted pregnancy, and even though it has begun to approach the important topic of consent, and all of these subjects are important and necessary, are they enough? What are we taking away from children by not offering chastity to them? And when I say chastity, I mean the kind of chastity that is, like I said earlier, held in a new and a modern light, not one that's about preaching about not having sex or shame, but one that says you are a special someone. Let's start with you first. Let's talk about self-esteem and confidence and the exploration of how you feel about your sexuality outside of the pressure-filled, fast-paced culture that all children are now faced with. Because authentic sexuality is important, it takes time to develop, it needs freedom and imagination, and I believe liberation from having it defined by peers and the internet. And that is the kind of chastity that really interests me. I mean, if we don't explore reframing chastity and encouraging authentic sexuality, then aren't we as adults failing in our responsibility to offer children every single choice possible? Chastity could be framed as an option that is not about telling them what not to do or frowning upon their surging hormones or sexual desire, but as an option that is based on the possibility of firstly choosing not to participate in the fast pace of today's sexual culture, which is predominantly dictated by technology. When we look at the statistics of mental health issues in Australian youth, 1 in 4 suffers, and 3 out of their top concerns are body image related issues. Now, mental illness is a very complicated subject, but surely we can be exploring how early education in relation to finding authentic sexuality, and more importantly, how releasing the pressures of them feeling like they must be seen as sexually desirable might just help some of them. For me, this is the main reason that we need to normalise the conversation around chastity in the 21st century, and it is for the children, even when it comes to making them and keeping them in happy and safe environments, which I know that both Rob and Nikki are interested in, and Rob already has and Nikki will talk to you about. But part of the research that I looked at for this debate was looking at the work of therapist Esther Perel, who travels the world researching relationships and educating people on the secret to maintaining desire in long-term relationship. And I really think, please look at her work, she really is onto something. She says that partners found their mates most attractive when they were able to see them as complete individuals, complete and self-sustaining. Now, doesn't that begin with healthy self-esteem and confidence? And shouldn't that first start with early education about putting a relationship with yourself first? We want to help people build healthy, long-lasting relationships that maintain desire so that they can produce children and bring them up in a happy and healthy environment. So what if chastity in the 21st century is about exploring your relationship with yourself, about finding your authentic sexuality so that you can first be good to yourself and secondly, choose to relate to a mate from a more whole and individual place? Now, surely that sounds like an option that we should be considering.
Well, as a sexologist, I think it was no surprise that I'm going to be saying that chastity is not going to be saving the 21st century. But the next challenge I have is to tell you why that is. And I just want to encourage you to think about something. How many times do you think the average male thinks about sex a day? 400. The average of that is 34. The average woman, if you've got a quick moment to think in your head, is 143, I think to be precise, with an average of 19. And what about the average sexologist? In my job, I'm constantly thinking about sex, and you do start to wonder, this is something that is very normal and natural. If a man can think about sex 400 times a day, then how can we control something that is constantly in his life? Now, I use the word control to define chastity because obviously one of the issues in this debate is how do we define this term? maybe this is a term that we should, instead of even redefining, no longer use. But for the purpose of this debate, I want to use the word control because that was the aim of chastity. Even though we did say that we were not going back to the days of no sex before marriage, I want to prove to you where control in our society has not worked. And I'm going to do that with a population in South Carolina. Now, South Carolina has the highest amount of abstinence-only sex education programs. A lot of people will start to argue, well, that's not necessarily influenced by religion, that's something that's backed by science, but in this particular population, I do want to focus on the religious approach. So we see young people, whether they're belonging to a church or whether this is a church that is heavily involved in a school, being encouraged to pledge their virginity at a young age. They still think that boys and girls have cooties. They don't know about sexual desires. They don't know how their body works. They're given a big party, they're given a ring, they're taken together as a group to conform and make this pledge that sex is something that should be given away upon marriage. What then happens as they grow older is that there is a certain amount of guilt that, well, I made this pledge as a young child and this is now a choice. So we're seeing people stand up and say, this is my choice, but I argue whether that is actually choice or whether that was control that was given at a young age. And keeping in mind that this is taught as the only form of sex education for this population. Now, South Carolina, a place that has the highest amount of abstinence-only sex education programs, also has the highest amount of teen pregnancy. So we can start to look at that control over sexuality doesn't exactly work. And what are we so fearful of about educating teens about sex? If the argument is we don't want them to have sex at a young age, then we can balance that out with some Aussie research that says adequate sex education can actually increase the age at which teens first have sex. So is it control that we should be focusing on for this generation, or is it education? Now, amongst these groups where abstinence is only taught, we're also seeing a high level of anal and oral STIs. If we're trying to protect our youth to make positive decisions, to protect themselves physically, to protect themselves emotionally, then this is failing them. And we often really need to ask ourselves, it's a scary world that we do live in where we do have high rates of STIs amongst that population, but what is it that they need? Do they need control or do they need education? Now, another population that I see control has harmed us is the modern woman. Now, this is obviously my area of expertise at the moment. I consider myself a modern woman and I've just been writing about it and I have been studying this notion of, which I hate using this word, slut shaming. Even saying the word slut to me makes me feel a bit uneasy because forever that we have existed, women's sexuality has been controlled with this fear of degradation. But if we have women that are thinking about sex up to 140 times per day, obviously they're sexual beings. They want, they desire, they engage in sex. Yet we have this notion that too much sex these days will damage you. Recently there was a case of a young girl whose Tinder profile was taken, screenshotted, and put on a Facebook page with some pretty derogatory lyrics. And she actually received hate and threats because of that. It was something that police eventually got involved in, but I wanted to know why that person felt just because she was on Tinder that they then had the right to degrade her for possibly wanting a casual hookup, for maybe wanting casual sex. How many people do you actually have to sleep with these days to be defined as a slut? I don't know if anybody out there has ever copped that terminology, but I did when I was 14 and I'd never even kissed a boy, just because I was interested in someone of the opposite sex and I started to maybe make movements towards that person. Now, if I would have been educated about my own sexuality and how that label affected me, maybe I could have dealt with that. But at that age, it was a devastating blow to my self-esteem. I also want to share with you a comment that was given to me on Instagram. I recently, as I said, put out a book that is encouraging women to explore their sexuality. And someone said, in inverted commas, have sex with different men. Yeah, because We all want to marry whores with STIs. There is this notion out there that the modern woman is damaging herself from too much sexuality, from expressing it, from having it. And we can't protect our youth from that. What we need to be doing is educating them so they're able to take all these influences that come from social media, that tell them to take their clothes off, that tell them that this is the notion of what is sexy, and give them the tools that they can make sense of it in their own world. We can't protect them completely. We can't wrap them up in cotton wool. What will save our generation, our 21st century, is by giving them the facts. Teach them about the implications of sexting. Teach them about the implications of advertising, of social media, of what the Kardashians mean to their sense of self-worth. So I really think it's not chastity that is going to be saving the next generation. If we look at what control has done to us, it has damaged and harmed us. So therefore, we really need to be questioning how we can educate the 21st century so that they're able to make sense of not only their own sexuality, but the sexual messages that get pushed upon them.
I've got to be honest, I haven't paid attention to anything because it's really hard when you're sitting next to someone who's so goddamn sexy, and I think Imogen would agree. How hot is Scott Stevens? Too much. I thought I was going through an early menopause, but anyway, we'll get on with the debate. I remember a glorious time when chastity was a powerful word that suggested sexual abstinence, but now when I hear the word chastity, it is usually in the sentence, here's me daughter Chastity, here's me other daughter Shiraz, and the little fella over there is Holden. It's at this point I wish the parents of these children had practiced chastity instead of drinking a $3.99 bottle of Shiraz in the back of a classic car. I've also taken a vow of chastity recently. I have found I have also achieved a lot because of this. No longer am I wasting my time on Facebook and social media. Now I am going to the gym and I am running and running and running and running and running and running. And my desire to breathe without crying means I don't think about sex anymore. In fact, going to the gym a lot and cutting out sex has meant I have cut back most of my crying. Before I embraced the idea of chastity, I was spending too much time on dating sites like Tinder and OkCupid and Red Hot Pie. Now, rather than swiping left or right on Tinder, I'm swiping left or right on games like Fruit Ninja. I've discovered that I'm, in fact, okay without OkCupid, and I'm no longer freaked out when at midnight I feel like a snack and I get on the wrong side. Jenny from Blacktown, if you're listening, I was looking for a vegetarian pie, and I am now definitely not looking for anything else. Embracing chastity has led to some important breakthroughs in my life. I've gotten a lot of important things achieved recently, like I finally watched all 5 seasons of Friday Night Lights and realised deep down I want to move to America and coach American football. Before that, I watched all of the seasons of Breaking Bad, and it made me realise that I want to move to America and become a chemistry teacher. I actually watched all of Mad Men, and now I want to go to America and meet Don Draper. And either way, chastity has inspired me to dream again. And whether I move to America to coach gridiron, cook meth, or score a restraining order from John Hamm, at least I'm inspired again. But here's the main thing about chastity. And you know what? I'm going to say something. This sometimes offends people, but whatever, right? Like, anyway, I'm going to come forward, right? But chastity is really important because it means less kids. And now I'm going to say something. This sometimes offends people. So if you get offended, sit back and don't enjoy the next 2 minutes. But if you agree with me, feel free to clap and cheer and let me know you're on my side, right? Let's roll the dice on this, right? Some people's babies are really ugly. Right. I'm not saying they won't grow up to be beautiful, but when you look at them now, you think, that's not right. Do you know what I mean? And they cause problems because people can't be honest about their babies. This happened to me. I turned up, my friends had a baby, it was less than 24 hours old. I thought, you know what, I'm going to go and meet the baby at the hospital. And when I turned up and I saw the baby was hairy. It wasn't fluffy, it wasn't fuzzy, it was hairy. It had a low hairline, it had a monobrow, it had hair on its back. This little girl was hairy, right? And I did a double take when I walked in because the baby was there, my friends were there, and I walked in like this, and I went, hey, everyone. It's like, ah! And there were like 6 or 7 friends looking at me going, don't say anything, don't say anything, don't say anything. I said, has anyone mentioned the hairy baby? They're like, no. So we're all standing around feeling awkward, and the dad picks up the baby and looks at us and goes, have you ever seen a prettier baby? And in my head, I was thinking, yes. That baby's pretty. It is pretty hairy. got a kind face. I kind of want to kick in with my steel caps in case it bites me and I get rabies. And everyone who walked in did a double take. Like the next person who walked in, went, hello, ah! And then the next person walked in and went, hey, ah! And then someone walking past was just like, Gary, can you get me the, ah! And kept walking. I can see some of you giving me stink eye about this baby, but when I say the baby was hairy, it was really hairy. Like if someone had said that Fozzie Bear was the father of the baby, I would have gone, I can see a family resemblance. If someone said, you know, it's a full moon tonight, I would have gone, that explains a lot about your baby. If someone told me that the baby had given the mum a Brazilian on the way out, I've gone, yeah, and it's still covered in the hair, right? If someone told me the baby's name was Fuzzy Velcro Face, I would have gone, that is a good name for your baby. Anyway, we're all standing around. It gets worse. Everyone's feeling awkward. No one can bring it up. If they hadn't had this baby, we would have just been having a good time. But we're feeling awkward. And then at some point, it turns out the baby has an ailment of some sort, because that's what they always have. They have some little ailment. And my friend, who's a homeopath and a really good person, says, oh, you know what's good for that ailment? Get a little bit of eucalyptus oil, rub it in, and it'll clear it up. And at this point, the dad snaps. The dad, in front of everyone, looks at my friend, who is a good person, and goes, yeah, see what you're doing there, You just suggested eucalyptus oil because you're suggesting my baby looks like a koala. Well, we weren't thinking that before, but we're definitely thinking it now. That's not Rosemary's baby, that is Blinky Bill's baby. Less babies. They cause problems all over the place. You know what one of my favourite things to see is a hushed, angry argument between parents over a baby. Less babies, less kids, less hushed, angry conversations. I was at the Sydney airport. I was going to get myself a snack because I dig snacks. And in front of me was a husband and wife and their four-year-old boy. And the husband had bought the boy a muffin. And the mum hadn't realised. And when she discovered, she was not cool about it. And I have seen her turn around and go, did you just buy him a muffin? Yeah, I bought him a muffin. Why did you buy him a muffin? Because he's been a good boy and I thought he deserved a treat. Well, if he wanted a treat, why don't you get him an apple or a carrot? Because that's not much of a treat. But now he's going to be full of sugar. He's going to be running around for hours. We are stuck in this airport for hours. I'm sure it'll be fine. Well, of course you'd say that. Oh, of course you'd say that. Because what's going to happen? We're going to get home. You're going to go straight to bed like you always do. And I'm going to be up for hours trying to calm him down. And by the time he calms down and he goes to bed, I'll have a chamomile tea to soothe my nerves. And by the time I want to go to bed, guess what won't be put away? The luggage. Because you never put the luggage away. I can't go to sleep until the luggage goes away. So then I'll put the luggage away. I'll get about 3 minutes sleep. Then I'll wake up because you won't wake up because you're Captain Snorryhead. Hey, calm down. When we get home, why don't I put him to bed? Oh, really? When was the last time you put him to bed? Hey, I work hard and long hours so we can go on a holiday and have a good time like we're having now. Oh, really? Are we having a good time? Really? Are we going to do this now? And I was behind watching going, do it now. Because it was awesome. Oh. Thank you. So, in summation, chastity will obviously lead to happiness if you channel all that excess energy into something important. Take that sexual frustration, climb a mountain, take that extra space in your mind and contemplate the complexity of the universe. Less sex means less children. Imagine living in a world where you can speak to your friend and their kid doesn't come up and go, I've got Lego stuck up my ass. Like, that would be amazing. Imagine going to a cafe and not having to hear 5-year-old Georgia go, I want a baby Chino. Like, that will be a great life. No kids will make you really happy. And think of all the things that you could think. You could think of stacks of heaps of things. Like, that is a lot of things. So you might be able to think up solutions to world poverty. You could think of ways to fix the environment. You could think of ways to save the world. All you need to do is embrace chastity. And when I say embrace it, don't embrace it for a little bit too long and get a little bit erect. I mean just a little pat on the back and move on. Being friends with chastity will help us save the 21st century. Thank you.
Just in for the ramblings of what sounded like an extremely sexually frustrated man. It's good that you got it out. Ladies and gentlemen, tonight we've heard arguments from our opposition that chastity will save the 21st century. Their case is more leaky than a condom that's been sitting in a teenage boy's wallet for 5 years. They're trying to tell you tonight that the world we live in is oversexed and underloved, that sex and the very pursuit of it is an ill-timed bonus straining against the fabric of society, that we flit from sexual partner to sexual partner like the sinful bumblebee. Well, tonight they have looked out at you and they didn't say it, but
they have seen nothing but sinners and whores. They've looked out at you and all they see is the spent tissues lurking in the waste paper basket, the fumbling wristy on the last train home, the wobbly walk of shame in last night's heels. And they have said that we can save the world from sex just by, doing it less, just by thinking about it a bit more, just by making it authentic, just save it for special occasions like wedding nights or appropriate stages in your cycle of ovulation. Just like how we used to do it before, in the olden days, when everything was great. But before you go home and strap yourself into your chastity belts and feel the cold, sobering iron pressed against hot flesh and clank around in your bedrooms in your metal nappies like miserable robot babies, just hear us out, because we're saying to you magnificent sex-crazed bastards that we shouldn't be having less sex. We should just be having better sex. And as they say, practice makes perfect. So tonight we heard from Scott, first of all. I'm just going to have a look at what they've tried to tell you tonight. That there was somehow a problem with our society and the way that we think about sex, and that we've just reduced it to being about codes of conduct and hygiene. A couple of things which I think we should keep, probably. That we've stopped giving moral instruction to young people. But that's the question, that's the problem with chastity. It's that suddenly we have to start saying, well, whose morals are we imposing? And we've been doing it for a very long time, and that hasn't been working out very well for us. He said that the people, our children who inherit sex, we have to make sure that they're worth it. But we're saying this is a problem. Putting sex up on a pedestal and saying it's something that we have to try and make ourselves worthy of, it's setting ourselves up for failure, and it's making us miserable. It's tied up in ideas like Rob and Nikki have discussed, of control and power, when in fact it should just be two or more people who enjoy each other's company, flapping their genitals against each other. It's really that easy. Scott talked about reducing sex to respect and consent, and I think it's an interesting thing to throw away those two concepts, respect and consent, things that we have as a society worked very hard to get to through conversations about sexual freedom and trying to get away from this idea of chastity, and I would say they're important. I'd also say I wouldn't want Scott to teach my children's sex ed class, because they come home with a painting instead of a condom on a banana. And then then I have to have that conversation with them, or a future sexual partner will be very confused when in the throngs of passion they're presented with a picture of a dog in a cornfield. We also heard from them tonight about that we live in a world of compulsory promiscuity and terrified sexual hypochondria, but we think that that's not the case, that sexual hypochondria is just about being careful. We've all, like, humans are awesome. We just figured out a way to have more sex and not get terribly sick or pregnant all the time. That's great. That only came about because we decided to get rid of that initial idea of chastity, that the only reason it exists is that men needed a way to find out how to control their land, and they didn't want their land when they died going to some other guy's kid, basically. I mean, that's where it initially comes from. And so when we say that pornography is shameful, and we hear from them that expressions of sexuality in our culture is grotesque, it comes with this inherent implication that it's inherently bad. These things are inherently bad, and they don't say why, and they don't need to, because this is the world that we've all grown up with, and it's embedded in us. And they just assume these things are inherently bad, because the flip side of chastity is shame and control and feeling impure. And when people are denied their ability to express themselves in a sexual way, which is part of their identity, we know from the cases of many LGBT and young people in our society who are denied that they come into a lot of trouble. Now, we heard from Imogen, who really pushed the definition of chastity. Let's be honest, it was about being that we could be sexually active, and it's about being authentic. It's like, if we want to redefine chastity that much, maybe we should just get rid of it. But because we cannot escape from that history that Rob talked about. We cannot escape from the idea that this is where it came from, with purity balls, which sounds like an awesome sex toy, but is not, unfortunately. The purity balls are these really creepy things where a father says to his daughter, "You belong to the Lord, also me," and then the guy who you end up being with. And it takes women away from all the agency. Goodness, is that the time? And I think that we have to realise that the only way that we're going to break cycles of violence and things like that in sex is we do have to talk about it. We do have to teach young boys about consent from a very young age, and that's something we've only just started realising in this world, and that came from rejecting chastity. We've heard a lot from them about, can somebody please think of the children, and that we need to have a relationship with yourself. But I'm telling you what, masturbation is a great way to have a relationship with yourself, and something that the Puritans would disagree with. So, we heard, of course, from Justin that the reason we should be chaste is so our babies aren't ugly, but really, we're not being chaste. We can sample our genetic partners like we're at Gelato Messina, and we can try every flavour. And you know when you settle down, you eventually have the right one.
Scott Stevens, I thought, made a pretty big play. His argument was that if you don't support chastity, you don't just lose that, you lose everything else as well, all of the virtues of a civilised society. What did you make of that, Nikki? You understand the risk that you're taking by arguing against what he's put.
I think we need to progress as a society. I think that by saying when we start to throw that out, we're going to lose all the others. It's like, well, I take it in the comparison, I think, to, and it sounds funny, Judaism and Orthodox versus progressive, and people will start to argue that once we start changing things, that we change the whole concept of the religion. And I'm of the side of we need to actually start looking at how that we can progress with the society and how we can work with what we've got. We have sex out there and we're flaunting it instead of controlling it. It's more about how do we work with it.
So, Scott, did I give a fair representation of your view? And do you really believe this, or was it just a good debating argument?
Oh, Simon, I never say anything that I don't mean. Look, I'm actually staggered that Team Opposite had to rely on the hackneyed old chestnut of control. I mean, seriously, who said anything about having less sex? Did anybody say anything about having less sex? The point is the focus sex? Or when you think of sex, do you think about the particular person that you're having it with? That is somehow some kind of byword, some sort of emasculated form of the human life. Then I'm sorry, but sort of public debate is pretty much screwed. When I said that chastity is art, I really do mean it. I don't mean in the sense of some sort of bizarre painting. When I say chastity is a
dog in a cornfield, I think was
well, dog in a cornfield. Dear God, Freud could have a field day with that. But when I say chastity is art, it is a skill. It's not the refusal of something, but it's the dedication to what counts most, what is most true, what is most good, what is most beautiful. I mean, you probably overstated things a little bit, Simon, when you said that if chastity goes, then all of human civilization goes. But chastity, like all virtues, is bound up with other virtues. If you are chaste, then it's probably because you're also empathetic. If you are not empathetic and chaste, then it means you're a sexual hypocrite. So virtues always go together, and when you lose a significant one, like the ability to self-control, then it seems to me...
Well, there you are, and that's the point. You've just introduced a word, control, which you said wasn't part of your argument.
No, but it's
self-control.
self-control. It's self-control. There's all the difference between that
okay. Well,
and leering Puritans on the corners.
Okay, leering...
Self-control.
Rob.
Why do you need to even come out of a night and speak about it? I mean, self-control is a private matter between, one consenting adult.
He's also putting in the view that this is an anachronistic argument that you've put, that, this invocation of the threat of others controlling the sexuality of women and planning. I mean...
Well, it's a historic argument, and it's based on something, approximating a dictionary definition of chastity. I don't know what Scott really means by chastity. I still don't know. It's really slippery. But it seems to be focused on the other and focused on some other really warm feeling. It doesn't seem to have anything to do with what I understand, having sort of, searched Wikipedia for 5 seconds. But, historically, that's what chastity has been. And when we start to agree that, yeah, this is something that we want, that becomes a mechanism for social control, and people will get involved. And they'll find very good uses to serve their own ends, to control people in ways that are not good for them.
Alex or Nikki, do you want to...
It was hard to kind of, grapple with what chastity is in this context, because it seemed for you guys that chastity is just all the good bits about sex, and that we just are left with the scraps. If we're not talking about it in the historical sense, then it's just talking about chastity as recognizing the power of sex. Would you guys agree?
I, for one, am really interested in human rights. And the one thing that all of you touched on was sexual minority groups and their rights. I'm really fascinated by the fact that you guys don't see somebody who is interested in practicing chastity or interested in redefining it and making it, held in a new light, that they shouldn't have a voice. Because you've talked a lot about controlling that and about shunning it, but there are people out there. I can tell you about a 12-year-old girl. This is not going to make you laugh. There's a 12-year-old girl who in her school was shamed because she didn't want to give a blowjob. She didn't want to sex. She didn't want to participate in it. She then started to cut herself, self-harm, because she felt anger and pain because she didn't want to participate in the fast pace of the sexuality that was going on at school. Now, why does that little girl not deserve to have a voice? Why does she not deserve to have a face and to be seen as a minority with a human right to say, hey, I don't want to? That doesn't make me bad.
Yeah, Rob?
I guess I'm just saying we need to have it as a choice and an option, and by you all saying, no, we can't even have it as an option, we can't even have it in the conversation, the history of it is bad, let's not talk about it, then aren't we taking away from that little girl the right to have that information?
We should talk about the history when we talk about people imposing it on others, or coming up with grandiose ideas like it's going to save the 21st century. Because every time anybody has come out and tried to impose control, the Romans, for instance, they've said this is for the good of society. This is going to keep Rome safe. You look at Rush Limbaugh, he says, Hurricane Katrina was because gay people were having too much sex. It's a bullshit argument.
But I'm not talking about offering it as an argument of control or imposing it on anybody. I'm actually talking about every single one of us as an individual. We all deserve the right to make a choice. And that means that now in our wonderful, beautiful, colourful world where we should have an emphasis on human rights and freedom of choice, that chastity should be a part of that.
I don't know who people are thinking about is going to impose sexual control. I mean, this is, what was the comment by Lord Macaulay? It's kind of like coming to Noah's flood and calling out fire. I mean, in an age of massive individuality, the breakdown of virtually every social mores, do we really think that something's going to rise up, some kind of theocratic government's going to come up and impose control?
It can be a worldview which becomes so dominant that it makes people feel bad if they fall outside of this particular norm. But surely control isn't just about laws and controls, it's about norms and things of that kind as well.
Yes, but I think one of the wonderful things about chastity, the way that, the chasten just means to discipline, to restrain something. The beautiful thing about chastity within the context of this relationship with this person is that person's enjoyment, that person's desire, that person's love, and that person's dignity exercises a form of restraint on me. And then I embrace that. So I think that, that there is something necessarily ethical. There is also something dignifying about embracing forms of personal restraint and self-control precisely as a way of honoring the other person. I mean, that really, it seems to me, is where the rubber hits the road. It's not about frequency.
Okay. Well, let me turn it across now to Imogen's point to you, Nikki, because Imogen's attempt to redefine this as a self-restraint was as an antidote to a selfish society in which the pressure is always to have more, to do more. And I can understand, even if it's not the traditional notion, there's also a legitimate complaint that has to be answered in terms of whether or not a different norm, this time about the pursuit of one's self-interest, actually puts people in the position of a 12-year-old, I think, girl that you were describing. So what's the response to this?
Well, I think that it's interesting that what we're all discussing here, because I know there's a bit of confusion between this chastity and control and, you know, how we express ourselves. We're discussing sexual expression, whether that is choosing to restrain that and connect with somebody on a non-sexual level, because I still see reframing from sexuality as an expression of sexuality. How do you express yourself sexually? Well, I like to connect with someone emotionally. So I think that's a really interesting point, that we're kind of somewhere all on a similar page, as long as we start, you know, throwing out this idea of, well, maybe we should stop using the word chastity in our society. Maybe that is what will save us. But by saying that we all have different levels here and we're all discussing different levels of sexual expression, this is where I support the notion of education, that yes, we do need to discuss refraining from sexuality. Like I said, with the statistics of somebody on a non-sexual level, if we educate teens about sex, they actually do have a higher age at which they first engage in sex. They are practicing abstinence to a certain degree. With the case of the 12-year-old girl, we need a society that not only supports those women, but educates them so they know how to deal with that, or they at least know where to get help from when they're faced with information that is threatening their sexual expression. So I think whether we're looking at reframing from sex and connecting with someone on a deeper level, which we do need to focus more on this society, what we really need to be focusing more is how we express ourselves sexually and also the relationship we have with ourselves.
One way to test this idea and see
Okay.
where we fall either ways is to say, let's suppose the proper position was that unrestrained sexual freedom will harm the 21st century. Would anybody here agree that if it was completely unrestrained, that this would be a terrible harm to our society? I said it's no. You would unrestrained. You'd be...
Inherently, yes, because sex, apart from the obvious solo act, but you know, proper sex has, and I'm going to get in all sorts of trouble for saying that.
Yeah. I can hear the drums
At least
rolling.
2 sets of interests, possibly 3, possibly more sets of interests, and those interests cannot ever be completely, perfectly aligned.
Scott Stevens, your 2 minutes starts now.
Firstly, for all of you who are bemoaning the bad old days before the 20th century, when the sexual liberation movement sort of set everything free, I have 2 words for you. Jane Austen. Why don't you choose for me? Which would you take for your son, your daughter to read, to learn a little bit more about the relationship between sex and the good life? 50 Shades of Grey or Mansfield Park? Dear God, give us more Jane Austens. The second point, I think we can all agree that sexual education, especially some of the forms of sexual education we've heard tonight, has been pretty shit, hasn't it? Any form of sexual education that aims at producing guilt, that can only release itself in forms of repression and self-loathing, is not sexual education at all. It's Puritan bastardry. The third point, I'm not suggesting any kind of new form of political control. I'm not suggesting a return of the religious police. But I think something has happened to our imaginations. The idea that my sexual expression, my sexual enjoyment is bound inextricably to the sexual enjoyment of somebody else. That my rhythms are constrained by hers, that my desires are limited by hers. The very idea that that could somehow become something like a byword, that it is somehow something medieval or whatever. I think that really says that something has happened within our cultural imagination. There's some very fine moments in modern fiction in which we find beautiful heroes. I think of Ian McEwan's novel Saturday, in which a neurosurgeon, Henry Perrone, arrives home one night, looks at his wife in bed and says, for some reason, almost by a freak of nature, it's familiarity that excites him, not constantly lusting after the new. I think there's something that has to happen at the level of our cultural imagination.
Rob Brooks.
Scott, again, chastity is art. I'm convinced on that point, I must say. But I'm going to go for science here, and one of the most exciting scientists in this area at the moment is Dr. Zhana Vrangilova at NYU, and she did a fantastic study because, as you know, in that strange and bewildering place across the Pacific Ocean, there is a deep moral panic about the sex lives of college students. And parents, I think in particular, given the fees that they're paying to send kids to college these days, are really worried that they're all bonking and not doing the proper thing of trying to find a hubby or a wife, which is what the parents did. And so, so there's a huge issue. Obviously, technological shocks like the internet have made promiscuity a viable and workable option. And Vrangelova did this wonderful study in which she looked at college students across the whole college year, and really most students had 2 or 3 hookups or booty calls or whatever you want to call the casual sexual encounters in a year. Yes, some had 100, but mostly we're talking about a very, very few sexual encounters. And some of them did in fact have, tremendously negative psychological impacts on the students. And those students happen to be the ones that had what's called a low SOI. They're the students who already, in their personalities, in the pre-test personality measures, had an association between sex and guilt. But for the other students who came to college primed with an idea of sexual openness and breaking the shackles of sexual guilt, those students found those hookup encounters to in fact be psychologically good for them. And they did better and they flourished as a consequence of it. So the binary really here is that, yes, casual sex is bad for you if you believe that casual sex is bad for you. I don't want to get all postmodern on you, but nonetheless, if you break the shackles, if you educate people properly, and if they get the option to enjoy their sexuality, then it's psychologically healthy.
Thank you. Imogen Bailey.
I think I'm going to go back to the point of education in a sense that we have children here and we have adults here and we have technology in between, and technology being what I see represents the 21st century the most at the moment in this particular conversation. And whilst I would really love it if all the children in my family, I don't have children myself, but all my relatives were reading the wonderful Nikki Goldstein's material on the internet. I would be really happy if they were, but unfortunately they're not. The first time that children have access to sex education is on their smartphones, and it is within 12 seconds they have available straight into pornography. And that's what I'm talking about, is giving children the option and the access to all information. And that means giving them the option and the access to say, no, I don't want to participate in that. Actually, I do want to respect myself. I want to have a relationship with myself. Not only that, but when you look at mental health issues in youth, a lot of them stem from a loss of a sense of identity and self-esteem. Now, you cannot tell me that we can't work backwards and say, well, how about if we work on kids' self-esteem and their confidence, and we work on them being able to have a relationship that is authentic and their own with sex, that we may have less body image issues, we may have healthier children. I'm not saying that we should be abstaining from sex forever. I'm just saying that somewhere in their innocent years, where we as adults are pushing the information that we want, because we want more information, more information, more information. We want more of Nikki and the likes, and that's great and that's wonderful. But we cannot control where that information is going. We are no longer in the print era. We are no longer able to censor it. There is a trickle-down effect, and that is dangerous to children.
Thank you. Nikki Goldstein.
I think for this one, I'm really going to focus on definitions, and I think that we can agree that chastity is a notion that we really need to be tossing out here. And what we are discussing is sexual expression. But the problem with that is if we're going to take out chastity from the situation, we still have this element of control that exists in our society. One of the terms that was thrown about that we didn't really touch on was sexual freedom. Are we controlling sexual freedom? And I want to address that and say, what is sexual freedom these days? We see people that want to take off their clothes, and we see, the likes of Beyonce and J-Lo who have babies and take their clothes off and say, well, look how amazing I am because this is being a strong, confident woman. Is that sexual freedom, or is this conformity, and is this selling records? Is a film clip of a J-Lo and Iggy Azalea bumping up and down each other, is that what it means these days to be a confident, strong woman? These are the messages that are getting then sent down to other people who then think, I then have the right to be sexually free as well. That's not sexual freedom. So what I really do think we need to be looking at is how we educate in a society that we have a lack of definitions. We can't even define what sex is. We can't define what chastity is, how we control. And I think exactly what we did tonight by showing different opinions and different points of view on the one subject is the conversations that we really need to be taking out to a wider general audience. It's no longer useful just to stand up and say, this is the way it should be, this is the way that you should live your life sexually. We do need to show people different ways of sexual expression, all ways of sexual expression, and give them the tools so they can work out then how they want to live their lives, how they want to identify sexually, instead of just being a product from the society we live in, which is being bombarded full of over-sexualized messages, really for the purpose of sales and advertising.
Thank you. Justin Hamilton.
Look, I'm just a comedian who lives in Melbourne, so therefore I just want less kids in cafes. That's the whole inspiration for everything I had to say. But I guess I was raised by a single mum in the early 70s in Adelaide, represent, and mum was very scared of, the things that I would be learning from other people, especially from other kids and their fathers. And so at a very young age, she took me aside and she kind of taught me all the words that I needed to know. And I didn't know them, I was 17. But the thing is, where I was in grade 1, the kids would be saying all these words and throwing them around, and, I could kind of point out that they were incorrect. They'd use the word pussy, and I'd say, no, that is vagina. And they'd say, oh, knockers, and I'd say, no, that is breasts. And they'd say, that is cock, and I'd say, no, that is chicken. And it was... It was important. It was guidelines. That's what she was doing, and, sometimes I've lived up to those guidelines and sometimes I've failed, but, at least through those guidelines, I know when I have failed how I can right myself. And I think there's been a lot of talk about control, but I think maybe we've been controlled by the word to a certain extent. And what we're really talking about is using the word in the form of education. And as Alex pointed out, there's a distinct possibility that her kids, if Scott's the teacher, they won't get to slip a condom onto a banana, but maybe they'll paint a picture of one and then they can put it up in their lounge room and then they can keep looking at that and thinking, yeah, that taught me something.
Thank you. And Alex Lee, the last word.
I think the great thing about tonight's discussion is that we all agree that we need to be working towards having healthier relationships, and it's just about how we go about doing that. And if chastity is about self-control, I still think that's problematic because I still think it's putting sex front and centre, and because we've piled so much stuff on sex over the centuries, all historical stuff and religious ideas, and we actually should just make sex less important and have our sexual freedoms and then actually start talking about who we are separate to that. And if we can define ourselves away from sex and just have it as a way that people are social with each other. There was a sociologist, Randall Collins, who said sexual desire isn't chiefly aimed at physical pleasure or the production of children, but at connectedness with others. Sexual pleasure is fundamentally a social construct, and it's about social exchange, because that's who humans are. We're social people, and I think if we start thinking about sex like that, and then we can start asking ourselves other questions that aren't tied up in that. And that's why I think it's a bad idea to go back to chastity. You can't put a backwards cap on it and put it on a skateboard and say, it's cool now. Guys, it's not. It's still the same old thing that we've had to deal with, the thing that's been, as we talked about, as its historical origins. It's been really harmful to women and to men as well, and I think we just need to let it go, and we just need to start living in a post-chastity world.
Thank you. The motion was that chastity will save the 21st century. Before the debate started, it was undecided, 27%, for the motion, a rather depressing 12%, and 61% against. So what's happened now? 9%. No, it's actually interesting. No, undecided's gone right down to 7%. So this has been one of those debates that has really changed people's minds there. Now, how you decide these things is depending on the absolute result or the swing. Before, the vote used to be 12% for, it's now 36%. And the against vote is down from 61 to 57%. I declare the motion lost. The against side has won, but a really impressive effort by the for side to turn their situation around. Congratulations to those who have participated in the debate. Congratulations to your side for your victory. A big thank to you, everybody here in the audience, for joining us tonight. Please give yourselves a round of applause and join me in thanking our wonderful speakers. See you next time.